Item: SCP-616. Object Class: Keter. Special Containment Procedures: SCP-616 is to be kept in sight. Redacted. While grounded, repair personnel of a clearance level of 2 or above are allowed to enter the craft, and must conduct thorough pre-flight inspections to ascertain that SCP-616 is ready for flight. However, repair personnel are to maintain a distance of at least 3 meters from SCP-616-1. On flight days, only ordained and believing ministers of an Abrahamic faith with security clearance of level 4 or above may enter the aircraft, and must remain at least 0.94 meters, 3 featuring 1 in, from the threshold of SCP-616-1 at all times whilst the craft is grounded. SCP-616-1 should be kept from closing at all costs once activated. This necessitates a monthly manned flight. Failure to keep SCP-616-1 from closing will require initiation of Procedure 600 Shoki. Each flight, 7 Archbishops, ordained and believing in an Abrahamic faith, must surround SCP-616-1. Prayer directed at SCP-616-1 is to be sustained during the whole duration of the flight, usually 3 to 7 hours. Prayer must be sustained by all able subjects, but once SCP-616-1 has activated, previously established distance restrictions no longer apply. Subjects are in fact encouraged to try to physically stop SCP-616-1 from closing, though extreme caution must be taken to keep any personnel from falling through the threshold, as that will likely result in data expunged. In addition, one Foundation agent trained in flying commercial aircraft is to pilot SCP-616 through a pre-designed flight path, and must be able to maintain radio contact and information of events in SCP-616. Under no circumstances is the pilot cleared to approach SCP-616-1 once flight has begun. All personnel should be supplied with any religious paraphernalia they request before flight time. No extraneous personnel are to be present during flight for any reason, as they will likely be killed by SCP-616's activation, and provide corpses for reanimation or data expunged. The Roman Catholic Pope, or a similar Abrahamic religious figure, must bless the aircraft in accordance with the appropriate religious ceremony once per full year. The official must report to the Foundation and arrive physically at the containment site at least 3 days prior to the year elapsing. Failure to do so may result in the door opening, resulting in data expunged. In the unlikely event that any official misses the ceremony, a substitute of equal rank must be on hand to replace him or her. Furthermore, 2 nuclear devices with a combined yield of megatons are to be armed inside the aircraft at all times. In the event of an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, or if the door closes during flight, resulting in data expunged, or transfers hostile beings in large numbers, these devices are to be detonated if Procedure 600 Shoki cannot be enacted. Those with clearance 4 or higher, please see Document SCP-616 Cp3 Description. SCP-616 is a prototype Boeing, designed by and constructed on the 16th of June 1966 to specifications. Though superficially similar to the Boeing 737 which went into service shortly afterwards, SCP-616's model had various internal alterations, including data expunged, Despite the various alterations, the most important feature of SCP-616 is the center-left emergency door, which has been dubbed SCP-616-1. SCP-616-1 is a standard emergency door, though partially covered in extensive markings associated with satanic cults adhering to redacted. SCP-616-1 can be opened without major incident when grounded, and leads to the outside of the aircraft as expected. However, this is discouraged as nearly all personnel opening and or passing through the door have reported severe anxiety problems and a persistent feeling of being watched. Long-term observation or exposure to SCP-616 is not recommended. Observation using any sort of electronic device is satisfactory while SCP-616 is grounded, though some visual anomalies have been recorded, including data expunged. As such, it is advised that personnel known to have a high tolerance to disturbing imagery be assigned to observation duty, and work no longer than 3 consecutive days. All personnel involved in the repairs, observation, operation, or flight of SCP-616 must submit to psychological evaluations after each period of exposure. SCP-616-1 will autonomously open once every 30 days, and begin to close. This event can be considered the activation of SCP-616-1. The speed at which SCP-616-1 closes is highly dependent on SCP-616's altitude, velocity, and data expunged. It should be timed so that SCP-616-1 opens in mid-flight, at an altitude of approximately 10,972 meters and a speed of about 780 kilometers per hour. Failure to properly time this event is catastrophic, since SCP-616-1 closing fully while grounded could affect all life forms within an unknown radius, causing potentially hundreds of data expunged, posing severe threats to population centers, and requiring immediate use of Procedure 600 Shoki. Please see Document SCP-616-DE2 for further information on data expunged and effective means of termination. Once SCP-616-1 spontaneously opens, cabin pressure will destabilize as expected, and extreme turbulence is encountered. At various points during the flight, all present personnel may feel as if SCP-616 is quickly falling, though it has been ascertained that SCP-616 remains in relatively stable cruising conditions during all times, including during the times of these events. SCP-616-1's opening may cause certain individuals present to suffer fatal heart attacks or data expunged. Corpses with an undamaged larynx present within SCP-616 once SCP-616-1 activates seemingly reanimate for the duration of the flight. The corpses remain largely immobile, and as such, pose no physical threat, but are capable of speech. These speaking corpses should be terminated if possible, as their speech poses potential psychological dangers, as well as enable SCP-616-1's closing via data expunged. The language spoken by these reanimated corpses remains unidentified.